Welcome to Obscure Minds, a space where the darkest corners of the human psyche are revealed through true stories that were never meant to be told. Here, silence speaks louder than words, and every truth hides a shadow. The night was November 16th, 1957, and the moon hung pale and cold over the farmlands of Plainfield, Wisconsin, casting long shadows across fields that had witnessed generations of quiet rural life. But on this night, silence itself would become a confession. The gravel road leading to the Gein farmhouse crunched under the tires of police vehicles, their headlights cutting through the darkness like accusatory fingers pointing toward a truth no one was prepared to face. The temperature had dropped to 28 degrees, and the officers' breath formed ghostly clouds in the frigid air as they stepped out of their patrol cars, their boots breaking through the thin crust of November frost that covered the ground like a shroud. Sheriff Art Schley sat in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle, his weathered hands gripping the door handle with the kind of tension that comes from years of law enforcement experience, warning him that something was fundamentally wrong about this call. The missing person report for Bernice Worden had seemed routine enough when it first came in. A local business owner who had failed to return home. Her hardware store found empty with the cash register open and a sales receipt bearing the name Ed Gein, lying on the counter like a breadcrumb trail leading into the abyss. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, from which city and country are you watching, and what time is it there right now? The farmhouse stood before them like a monument to isolation, its windows dark and vacant, reflecting nothing but the cold light of the moon. No smoke rose from the chimney despite the bitter cold. No dog barked at their approach. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as the officers gathered near their vehicles, checking their flashlights and service weapons with the methodical precision of men who had learned to trust their instincts when something felt deeply fundamentally wrong. Deputy Leon Murdy later described the approach to the house as walking through a cemetery where the dead had forgotten how to rest, where the very air seemed to press against their chests and make their hearts beat with an irregular, anxious rhythm that had nothing to do with physical exertion. The farmhouse itself was a study in rural American architecture from the early 1900s, a two-story structure with a wraparound porch that had once been painted white but had long since faded to the color of old bones. The wood siding was weathered and cracked, and several of the window shutters hung at odd angles, giving the building an appearance of abandonment despite the knowledge that someone still lived there. The property stretched across 40 acres of farmland that had once been productive but now lay fallow, overgrown with weeds and scattered with the rusted remains of agricultural equipment that had been abandoned to the elements. When the door finally opened, the silence of the house spoke louder than any scream. Plainfield in 1957 was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were as rare as strangers, and where the most exciting event of the week might be a church social or a high school football game. The town of barely 400 souls nestled in the heart of Wisconsin farm country, surrounded by endless fields of corn, and dairy pastures that stretched to the horizon like a green ocean frozen in time. Main Street consisted of a handful of businesses: Worden's Hardware and Sporting Goods, where Bernice had worked for decades, the post office where neighbors gathered to exchange gossip along with their mail, a small grocery store that carried everything from penny candy to farm supplies, and Hanson's Tavern, where local farmers gathered on Friday nights to discuss weather and crops over bottles of Schlitz beer and games of cribbage. The social fabric of Plainfield was woven from the threads of routine and tradition that had sustained rural Wisconsin communities for generations. Church suppers at the Methodist Church brought families together every Sunday after services. The volunteer fire department organized annual fundraisers that served as much as social events as emergency preparedness. Children walked to the one-room schoolhouse without fear, playing in yards that stretched from property to property without fences or boundaries, trusting in a community that had always protected its own. But beneath this Norman Rockwell facade, whispers had been growing like weeds in the cracks of the community's foundation. Over the past few years, women had been disappearing from the surrounding areas with a frequency that was beginning to disturb the peaceful rhythm of rural life. Not many, and not often enough to cause widespread panic, but enough to make people lock their doors earlier in the evening and glance over their shoulders when walking alone after dark. Mary Hogan, a middle-aged tavern owner from nearby Pine Grove, had vanished 3 years earlier under circumstances that defied easy explanation, leaving behind only a pool of blood on her barroom floor and questions that had no comfortable answers. The disappearances followed no obvious pattern that law enforcement could identify. The victims were women of various ages, from different social backgrounds, with no apparent connections to each other beyond their gender and their residence in the general area. Some had simply vanished from their homes, leaving behind meals half prepared and doors standing open. Others had disappeared while running errands in town, their abandoned vehicles found days later on lonely country roads with no signs of struggle or explanation for their absence. Local folklore began to incorporate these disappearances into a broader narrative of rural unease that had been building throughout the decade. People spoke in hushed tones about strange lights seen moving through the woods at night, flickering between the trees like lost souls trying to find their way home. Some claimed to smell something carried on the wind when it blew from certain directions, something sweet and cloying that made their stomachs turn and caused their dogs to whimper and seek shelter inside the house. Children were warned to stay away from certain properties and wooded areas, though none of the adults could articulate exactly why these places felt dangerous. It was simply understood, the way people understand that some places are meant to remain untouched. Ed Gein himself was known around Plainfield as an odd but seemingly harmless bachelor who lived alone on his family's farm after his domineering mother Augusta had died in 1945. He was the kind of man who existed on the periphery of community life, polite when spoken to in town, quiet to the point of near invisibility, occasionally seen at Worden's hardware purchasing supplies or at various businesses around town picking up odd jobs that barely kept him financially afloat. Most people who knew him felt more pity than suspicion when his name came up in conversation. After all, what harm could possibly come from a shy, soft-spoken man who seemed more afraid of the world than the world should be of him? Those who had interacted with Gein over the years described him as strange but not threatening, eccentric but not dangerous. He spoke in a soft, almost feminine voice and had a habit of giggling nervously during conversations, especially when discussing topics that seemed to make him uncomfortable. His appearance was unremarkable. Medium height, thin build, prematurely gray hair that he kept neatly combed, and pale blue eyes that rarely made direct contact with those speaking to him. He dressed in the standard clothing of rural Wisconsin farmers, work shirts, overalls, and boots that had seen years of use but were kept reasonably clean and in good repair. The investigation into Bernice Worden's disappearance had led police to Ed Gein's name with the cold precision of mathematical inevitability. The receipt found in her hardware store dated November 16th and bearing his signature showed a purchase of a gallon of antifreeze, a mundane transaction that had somehow become the thread that would unravel one of the most disturbing cases in American criminal history. The receipt indicated that the purchase had been made around closing time, when Bernice would have been alone in the store, preparing to lock up for the weekend and return home to her family. When Sheriff Schley and his deputies arrived at the Gein farmhouse that evening, they expected to find a nervous suspect who might be hiding stolen goods or possibly holding Bernice against her will. They had prepared for the possibility of a hostage situation or a burglary gone wrong. Their training and experience had equipped them to handle armed suspects, violent confrontations, and even murder scenes. What they were not prepared for, what no amount of law enforcement experience could have prepared them for, was stepping into a world that seemed to exist outside the boundaries of normal human experience, a place where the familiar categories of crime and punishment simply did not apply. What they found instead was a darkness so profound and so completely alien to their understanding of human behavior that it would change them forever, leaving psychological scars that would never fully heal and memories that would haunt them for the remainder of their lives. Sheriff Schley's hand trembled slightly as he knocked on the weathered wooden door of the farmhouse, the sound echoing hollowly through the structure as if the building itself was empty, abandoned, holding nothing but air and shadows and the accumulated weight of years spent in isolation. When no answer came after several minutes of waiting, he tried the handle and found it unlocked, a detail that would later seem significant to investigators, as if the house had been waiting for them with the patience of a spider in its web, ready to reveal secrets that had been carefully preserved in darkness and silence. The door swung open with a prolonged creak that seemed to stretch into eternity, the hinges protesting with the voice of metal that had not been properly maintained for years. The sound was immediately swallowed by a darkness so complete it appeared solid, impenetrable, as if they were looking into a void that absorbed light and sound and hope with equal efficiency. Deputy Murdy clicked on his heavy-duty police flashlight, the beam cutting through the blackness like a knife through velvet, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny ghosts disturbed from their eternal rest. The smell hit them immediately. Not the clean scent of a well-kept home, not even the musty odor of neglect that might be expected from a bachelor's dwelling, but something else entirely, something organic and wrong that made their stomachs clench and their minds recoil from recognition. It was a smell that seemed to bypass their conscious thoughts and speak directly to some primitive part of their brains, triggering an instinctive revulsion that made them want to turn and flee back into the clean, cold air of the November night. They moved through the house like underwater explorers, each step deliberate and careful, their flashlight beams revealing glimpses of a domestic environment that seemed to exist in a state of suspended animation. The furniture was sparse and ancient, covered in layers of dust that suggested years of minimal disturbance. Newspapers, yellowed with age, were stacked in corners, their headlines speaking of world events and local news from years past, creating a sense of time displacement that added to the dreamlike quality of their exploration. The kitchen was where they first began to understand that they had stumbled into something that transcended their training, their experience, and their ability to process and categorize according to normal standards of criminal investigation. Items hung from the ceiling and lined the counters. Objects that at first glance appeared to be the usual implements of rural domestic life, but which revealed themselves under closer inspection to be something far more disturbing, something that challenged their fundamental understanding of what human beings were capable of creating and preserving in the darkness of their private spaces. The flashlight beams played across surfaces that reflected the light in ways that made the officers' hands shake and their voices catch in their throats when they attempted to radio their findings back to the station. Every item they examined seemed to tell a story that their minds refused to read, their consciousness protecting itself by blurring the details into merciful ambiguity that would allow them to continue functioning as law enforcement officers rather than collapsing under the weight of what they were witnessing. In the living room, they discovered furniture that appeared to have been modified in ways that defied both aesthetic sense and practical function. A chair had been upholstered in material that seemed too smooth, too pale, too unsettlingly familiar to the touch. Lampshades cast shadows that seemed to move independently of their light sources, creating patterns on the walls that suggested shapes and forms that the conscious mind rejected but the subconscious recognized with growing horror. Every surface in the house told a story that the officers' rational minds refused to acknowledge, their psychological defense mechanisms working overtime to maintain the illusion that they were still operating within the familiar parameters of normal police work, investigating crimes that could be understood and categorized according to established legal and moral frameworks. It was Deputy Murdy who made the discovery that would forever change how America understood the potential for evil that could flourish in the most ordinary of settings. In the woodshed behind the main house, a structure that appeared from the outside to be nothing more than a typical farm building used for storing tools and equipment, he found what remained of Bernice Worden suspended from the ceiling beams in a manner that spoke to activities and purposes that existed far beyond the boundaries of normal human comprehension. The sight was so shocking, so completely outside the realm of normal human experience that several of the officers who witnessed it had to step outside into the cold November air to prevent themselves from collapsing or losing consciousness entirely. The crime scene photographer who arrived later that evening, a man who had documented hundreds of accidents and violent crimes over his career, would require months of therapy afterward, haunted not just by what he had seen and captured on film, but by the realization that such things were possible in a world he had thought he understood. But the discovery of Bernice Worden's remains was only the beginning of a night that would continue to unfold like a nightmare from which there was no awakening. As the investigation expanded to include other areas of the house and property, a pattern emerged that painted a picture of activities that had been occurring for years, hidden behind the facade of a simple bachelor farmer, living alone with his memories and his grief, protected by the silence of isolation, and the unwillingness of his community to look too closely at behavior that seemed merely eccentric rather than dangerous. The official police report filed that night was a masterpiece of bureaucratic understatement, written in the careful language of men who understood that some truths were too dangerous to be recorded with complete accuracy. Police report. Plainfield Sheriff's Office, November 16, 1957. Entered premises at 8:47 p.m. Suspect not present at time of entry. Evidence recovered suggests criminal activities of extraordinary nature. Additional personnel requested from state authorities. Officers on scene advised not to speak publicly regarding details of investigation pending further review. The file was classified and sealed within hours of its creation, buried in government filing cabinets where it would remain locked away from public scrutiny for decades. What the sanitized official report could never capture was the psychological impact of that night on the men who experienced it firsthand. It couldn't describe the way the silence in that house seemed to have weight and substance, pressing against their eardrums like water pressure at great depths. It didn't mention how their flashlight batteries seemed to drain faster than normal, as if the darkness itself was hungry for their light and actively working to consume it. The report couldn't convey the way the temperature seemed to drop several degrees in certain rooms without any apparent cause, or how even the most seasoned officers found themselves whispering without conscious decision, as if speaking at normal volume would somehow awaken something that was better left undisturbed. The discovery at the Gein farmhouse sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community that extended far beyond the borders of Wisconsin and reached into the highest levels of federal criminal investigation. Within days of the initial discovery, investigators from the FBI arrived in Plainfield, men in dark suits who spoke in hushed conferences with local authorities and took measurements and photographs that would never see the light of day. The farmhouse was declared an active crime scene and cordoned off with official tape and barriers, but more significantly, it was surrounded by a wall of official silence that would prove more impenetrable than any physical security measure. The media, initially drawn to the story by reports of a missing person case that had resulted in an arrest, quickly found themselves confronted by a coordinated effort to minimize and control the flow of information to the public. Press conferences were brief and uninformative, consisting mainly of official statements that revealed as little as possible while maintaining the appearance of transparency. Reporters who attempted to dig deeper into the story found doors closing and sources refusing to speak, as if the entire community had collectively decided that some truths were too dangerous to share with the outside world. Memo, Wisconsin State Police, January 15, 1958. Public disclosure of specific crime scene details remains prohibited under federal advisement following consultation with psychiatric professionals and community welfare specialists. All personnel involved in the Plainfield investigation are reminded that their oath of service includes the protection of public welfare through the careful management of sensitive information that could prove harmful to community stability if widely disseminated. The memo was classified at the highest levels and distributed only to those with appropriate security clearance, ensuring that the full scope of what had been discovered at the farmhouse would remain hidden from public view indefinitely. The coordinated effort to suppress information about the Gein case raised questions that went far beyond the specific details of the crimes themselves. Why was there such a comprehensive attempt to bury the truth so deeply that even decades later, much of what happened in that farmhouse remains shrouded in official mystery? The answer lies not just in the shocking nature of the individual acts that were discovered, but in what those acts represented about the potential for darkness that could exist within seemingly normal communities, within the carefully maintained facade of American rural innocence that the 1950s held as sacred and inviolable. The town of Plainfield became unwittingly complicit in its own silence, not through any malicious intent or conscious conspiracy, but through a collective psychological defense mechanism that allowed the community to survive the knowledge of what had been living and growing in their midst for years without their awareness or intervention. Neighbors who had waved politely to Ed Gein when they encountered him at the post office, store owners who had conducted routine business transactions with him, church members who had occasionally seen him at Sunday services, all of them were forced to confront the terrifying possibility that evil doesn't announce itself with fanfare and obvious warning signs, but can exist in the shadows of the most ordinary lives, patient and hidden, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself to an unprepared world. The psychological implications of the Gein case extended far beyond the individual pathology of one disturbed man living in isolation on a Wisconsin farm. It forced Americans across the country to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of community responsibility, about the way neighborhoods and towns can fail to recognize or respond to warning signs that, in retrospect, seem obvious and unmistakable. The case became a dark mirror reflecting society's capacity for willful blindness, its preference for comfortable ignorance over the difficult truths that might require action, intervention, or acknowledgement of collective failure. Some psychologists and criminologists who studied the case in later years suggested that Gein's descent into criminal behavior was not the result of sudden mental breakdown, but rather the product of decades of psychological deterioration that had occurred in plain sight of a community that chose not to see, not to investigate, not to ask the difficult questions that might have prevented tragedy. His increasing social isolation following his mother's death in 1945, his obviously deteriorating mental state, his strange behavior, and inappropriate responses to normal social interactions. All of these warning signs had been present and visible to anyone who cared to look closely, but they had been consistently ignored or dismissed as harmless eccentricity by neighbors who found it easier to look the other way than to get involved in someone else's problems. The farmhouse itself became a symbol that transcended its physical reality and took on mythological significance in American popular culture. Even after the structure was demolished in 1958, supposedly to prevent it from becoming a morbid tourist attraction that would bring unwanted attention to the community, the land continued to exert a strange fascination over visitors, researchers, and curiosity seekers. People reported feeling inexplicably uneasy when driving past the property, even decades later when new structures had been built on different parts of the original farm, and the physical evidence of what had occurred there had been completely erased from the landscape. Local folklore began to incorporate the Gein case into a broader narrative of supernatural dread that reflected the community's inability to process and integrate the reality of what had happened in their midst. Stories spread of unexplained lights seen moving through the woods where the farmhouse had once stood, of voices heard calling from empty fields during the darkest hours of night, of dogs refusing to walk along certain roads. After sunset, their instincts warning them away from places where human evil had left an indelible mark on the very fabric of reality. Whether these phenomena had any basis in objective reality or were simply the product of collective psychological trauma, they served an important function in maintaining a barrier of fear and superstition around the memory of what had happened there, ensuring that the site would remain undisturbed and that the community's desire to forget would be respected by outsiders who might otherwise be tempted to investigate or exploit the location for commercial purposes. The influence of the Gein case on American popular culture extended far beyond the borders of Wisconsin and the specific details of the crimes themselves. Authors, filmmakers, and other creative professionals found in the story a perfect metaphor for the darkness that lurks beneath the surface of American normalcy. The monster hiding behind the mask of the quiet neighbor, the harmless eccentric who keeps to himself and never bothers anyone until the moment when his carefully maintained facade finally crumbles to reveal the horror that was always lurking underneath. These fictional interpretations and adaptations, while loosely based on the facts of the Gein case, often sanitized and sensationalized the reality of what had occurred, transforming complex psychological horror into entertainment that could be consumed by mass audiences without forcing viewers to confront the deeper implications of what the case revealed about human nature, community responsibility, and society's capacity for willful blindness in the face of uncomfortable truths. The real horror of the Gein case was not to be found in the shocking nature of the specific crimes that were discovered in that farmhouse, but rather in the profound questions it raised about the society that had produced and harbored such darkness for years without recognizing it or taking action to prevent it. How many other individuals like Ed Gein were living quietly in communities across America, their dangerous pathology hidden behind facades of normalcy that fooled neighbors, law enforcement, and social service agencies? How many warning signs were being ignored or dismissed by people who preferred not to get involved, not to ask uncomfortable questions, not to peer too closely into lives that seemed merely eccentric rather than genuinely dangerous? The case forced law enforcement agencies across the country to develop new protocols for investigating reports of suspicious or unusual behavior, new training programs designed to help officers recognize signs of serious psychological disturbance that might indicate potential for violence, and new systems for coordinating information between agencies when dealing with crimes that transcended normal categories of criminal behavior and challenged established methods of investigation and prosecution. The Federal Bureau of Investigation began studying the Gein case as part of their emerging understanding of what would later be classified and systematically studied as serial killing, using his psychological profile as a template for identifying similar patterns of behavior in other cases, and developing new methodologies for tracking and apprehending individuals who committed multiple murders over extended periods of time. The case became a foundational element in the development of criminal profiling techniques that would revolutionize law enforcement's approach to solving complex crimes and understanding the psychology of violent criminals. Yet even as the case contributed significantly to advances in criminal psychology and law enforcement methodology, it remained shrouded in layers of official secrecy that have proven remarkably resistant to the passage of time and changes in government policy regarding the declassification of historical documents. Files that should have been made available to researchers and the public decades ago remain sealed in government archives. Witnesses who are still alive continue to refuse requests for interviews about what they saw or experienced. The wall of silence that was erected around the case in 1957 has survived changes in federal and state governments, shifts in public attitudes toward transparency and accountability, and the passage of more than half a century. This enduring official secrecy has only served to enhance the mythological status of the case in American popular consciousness, creating an information vacuum that has been filled by speculation, rumor, conspiracy theories, and fictional interpretations that may or may not bear any relationship to the historical reality of what happened in that farmhouse during those years of silence and isolation that preceded its discovery by law enforcement. Perhaps the most profoundly disturbing aspect of the Gein case is not what it revealed about one man's descent into madness and criminal behavior, but what it suggested about the capacity of entire communities to participate in collective denial, to choose comfortable ignorance over difficult truth, to prioritize social stability and peace of mind over the safety and welfare of vulnerable individuals who might have been protected if people had been willing to ask hard questions and take appropriate action. The silence that surrounded Ed Gein's activities for years before their discovery was not accidental or unavoidable. It was the product of conscious and unconscious choices made by individuals who preferred not to know, not to investigate, not to intervene in situations that seemed strange or unusual, but not immediately threatening to their own safety and welfare. Some say it was simply madness, the tragic result of mental illness that went untreated in an era when psychological disorders were poorly understood and effective treatments were not available. Others believe it was something older and more fundamental, a manifestation of darkness that has existed in human nature since the beginning of recorded history, waiting patiently through the centuries for the right circumstances and the right individual to serve as its vessel for expression in the modern world. The physical farmhouse may have been demolished. The tangible evidence may have been destroyed or locked away in government vaults where it will never again see the light of day. But the questions raised by the case continue to echo through American consciousness with undiminished power and relevance. Every time a neighbor commits an unthinkable crime, every time a community is forced to confront the reality that they unknowingly harbored a dangerous individual for years, every time the facade of suburban or rural normalcy is shattered by the revelation of hidden horrors, the ghost of Ed Gein's farmhouse rises again to remind us that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs and dramatic warning signals that allow good people to take protective action before tragedy occurs. In the end, the House of Silence that Ed Gein created was not merely a physical location where terrible crimes were committed, but rather a psychological and social space that exists wherever communities choose the comfort of willful ignorance over the difficulty of confronting hard truths, wherever individuals decide that someone else's strange or disturbing behavior is not their responsibility to address, wherever the natural human preference for normalcy and stability overrides the moral obligation to protect vulnerable members of society from those who would harm them. The town of Plainfield eventually healed from its trauma, as communities inevitably do when faced with tragedy that threatens to overwhelm their capacity for understanding and acceptance. New families moved into the area, bringing fresh perspectives and untainted memories. Children grew up who knew the Gein story only as local legend, a cautionary tale told in whispers rather than a living memory that continued to cast shadows over daily life. The rhythms of rural existence reasserted themselves. Church suppers and school programs, harvest festivals, and high school football games. Life continuing with the resilient determination that characterizes small American communities faced with challenges that test their fundamental beliefs about human nature and community safety. But healing is not the same thing as forgetting, and forgetting is not equivalent to understanding or learning from the experience. The lessons embedded in the Gein case about the responsibility of communities to actively protect their most vulnerable members, about the critical importance of taking seriously signs of psychological disturbance and social isolation, about the real danger of allowing mental illness and antisocial behavior to fester without appropriate intervention, remain as relevant and urgently important today as they were in 1957, when those police officers first walked through the door of that silent farmhouse. The silence that once protected Ed Gein's secrets and allowed his criminal activities to continue undetected for years has been replaced by a different kind of silence. The silence of official secrecy, bureaucratic cover-up, and collective amnesia that seeks to bury uncomfortable truths rather than learn from them. Important files remain sealed. Crucial witnesses maintain their refusal to speak publicly about their experiences, and the full truth of what happened in that farmhouse during those dark years may never be completely known or understood by future generations who might benefit from that knowledge. But perhaps that outcome is inevitable, even appropriate. Perhaps some truths are indeed too dangerous to be fully revealed to a society that may not be psychologically prepared to confront them. Perhaps some knowledge is too disturbing to be completely understood without causing more harm than good. Perhaps some revelations are too corrosive to the social fabric to be widely shared without risking the stability and functionality of the communities that must continue to exist and thrive despite their awareness of the potential for evil that exists within human nature. Maybe the House of Silence never truly vanished from the American landscape. Maybe it simply moved to new locations, finding fresh hiding places in the collective unconscious of our society, taking up residence in the minds and hearts of those who remember what happened in Plainfield and carry that knowledge forward into an uncertain future. Maybe it waits patiently in suburban neighborhoods and rural communities across the country for the next opportunity to reveal itself to remind us once again that the monsters we most need to fear are not mythical creatures from distant places and ancient times, but the quiet neighbors who live among us, the ones who keep to themselves and never seem to bother anyone. The ones who appear harmless and unthreatening until that terrible moment when their carefully maintained silence finally speaks and reveals the horrors it has been protecting all along. The land where Ed Gein's farmhouse once stood remains largely empty today, not because of any legal restriction or official prohibition, but because of an unspoken understanding that some places are meant to remain undisturbed, allowed to return to nature and fade from memory, rather than being developed or repurposed for new human activities. Visitors to the area continue to report a persistent sense of unease that seems to have nothing to do with their knowledge of the property's dark history. A feeling that they are being watched by unseen eyes, that they have stumbled into a place where the normal rules of reality don't quite apply, where silence has accumulated weight and substance and memory that continues to affect the living world decades after the events that created it. If you enjoy watching documentaries and real stories based on true events, stay with us and follow this channel. We're truly grateful to have you here. The story of Ed Gein's House of Silence serves as a permanent reminder that the most profound horrors in human experience are not necessarily the ones that announce themselves with obvious terror and dramatic violence, but rather the ones that grow quietly in darkness, nurtured by isolation and protected by a community's willingness to look the other way when confronted with behavior that seems merely strange rather than actively dangerous. The real monster in this story was not just the individual man who committed unspeakable acts in the privacy of his own home, but the broader silence that allowed those acts to continue undetected and uninterrupted. The collective blindness that chose comfort and denial over the courage required to confront difficult truths and take protective action. Some stories were never meant to be told, buried as they are beneath layers of official secrecy, community shame, and collective trauma that makes their full revelation too dangerous for public consumption. But now that you've heard this one, now that you've been exposed to the knowledge of what human beings are capable of doing when left alone, with their darkest impulses and protected by society, is willingness to ignore warning signs. There's no way to unhear it, no way to return to the comfortable innocence that existed before you knew that such things were possible in the world you thought you understood.